The following program has been rated GE. It is therefore suitable for general family viewing.
Hello and welcome to Kikao, your weekly guide on Africa's agriculture. My name is Joe Ageyo. Now, in this week's episode, we focus on partnerships. What is the place of public-private partnerships in driving innovation in the agricultural sector? In a short while, we'll be having that discussion, but first, the scene setter.
We work with the private sector. We promote all these varieties that exist in the market through a farmer-centered approach. We ensure that they're adopted, and once they're being produced and marketed in a wide scale, the private sector takes over to do three things: to ensure that these farmers have access to the seeds, to ensure that these farmers have access to fertilizer, to ensure that these farmers have access to agrochemicals, and to ensure that these farmers have access to the markets. All those are farmer-centered, private sector-driven approach, which we work on to ensure that everything fits in tandem for the benefit of farmers.
Let's now join Dr. Canisius Kanangire, as always, the Executive Director of AATF, for a deeper conversation on partnerships as a key to innovation in agriculture.
It is recognized that no single organization can on its own accomplish its goals and aspiration of transforming the livelihoods of smallholder farmers. Partnerships and building synergies are inevitable approaches towards delivering agricultural technology to farmers. The African continent has a long history of sustainable agricultural development partnerships, all aimed at helping farmers produce more food for increased income and sustainable livelihood. Indeed, the concept of public-private partnerships holds great promise for achieving agricultural development in Africa. This is because sustainable partnerships and relationships are key to achieving the task of improving farmers' livelihood. In this edition of Kikao, we explore why effective partnerships and relationships are key for innovations to get to farmers in Africa. I am your host, Dr. Canisius Kanangire, Executive Director, AATF, and my guests today are Mr. Mark Edge, Director of Partnership, Seeds and Trade Business at Bayer, and Mark Priestley, Senior Director and Chief of Party for Economic Recovery and Reform Action at Trademark East Africa. You are welcome, sirs. Let me start by asking, what in your assessment would be the state of public and partnerships in Africa today in the agricultural sector?
Being part of a public-private partnership working to bring drought-tolerant and insect-resistant maize to Africa, working actually with AATF, I have a bias, I guess, that I think that public-private partners are in a very good state and because the project is working very well. But I also think on the broader scale of this, sometimes there's a lot of desire to have these things, and we talk about public-private partnerships, but putting them in place and implementing and actually making them work well is much more difficult to do than it is to talk about. And so we have a big challenge to make sure that when we talk about this, that we're creating substantive partnerships that are really delivering on things that are important for smallholder farmers in Africa. So I think that it's absolutely the right trajectory and to think about this, but finding the right combination of how to make those things work is, it takes time and a lot of effort and a lot of candid conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. You need to agree on what to do and the contribution of each one of you. Yeah, what would be or what should be an ideal public-private partnership in agriculture?
My organization is called Trademark East Africa. We're funded by government to provide aid to both the public sector and the private sector. So I think for us, we kind of work with both sides, so we're facilitators. And what you were saying earlier about the challenge of bringing these two parties together is quite challenging. But for me, maybe the best way to explain that is to give you an example. So we're working in Uganda to make available a plot of land for an agro-processor to come and invest in that land. That land is owned by the district government. And so what we try and do is make that land investor ready. So they provide the land, we facilitate finding the investor, and the investor brings the money and develops that, and they set up shop. The supply chain linking to the small scale farmers is a very important other element. And so in order to secure a supply, that private investor needs to link to small scale farmers. So they have set up a contract growing scheme for 2,000 farmers to reach out to them. So the other area where the private sector work with government is the work being done with cooperatives and things like this, extension services, so the government can also help provide skills and services like that, but with the private sector in working together. So I think maybe that's an interesting
and for me, I'm seeing it as a model which will ensure first the ownership of the projects that we run together by the public part of this partnership, because they come in, they contribute something, ownership is there. And also sustainability, I think. I don't know if you have seen it in projects you have already run, that both the ownership and a certain level of assurance of the sustainability of those projects.
Well, so if I could add a little bit of context there from the private sector at least, I think one of the most important things is that we align what we're doing in partnerships that are with our core business objectives. Because to make things sustainable, it has to be economically viable for the long term. And we have to know what business we're in and what are our primary objectives and what will long term be a sustainable business for us. And so we need to evaluate those proposals of projects from a standpoint of, although it sounds selfish, it's actually being more honest about being able to be a good partner in that, to say, we have to be able to turn this into that it's profitable and also then scalable. So it's great if you can go into one village and help there, but generally speaking from a business standpoint, you also want to make sure that when you start out, you start with the end in mind, that there's going to be growth and development. And as we put those partnerships together, then when we work with the public sector, it's very important to understand what it is that the public sector is looking as far as a public good that comes from it. What is their objective of what they're trying to see that would be beneficial? And does that line up with what we're trying to do from a private sector, so that we can say that both public and the private sector benefit from it?
I think it's very important for the government to appreciate what their role is in that sort of partnership, because sometimes governments, in their desire to help the small-scale farmer, they overreach and try and do things that maybe they're not best able to do. So, for instance, I gave the example of the agro-processing plant. Rather than the government trying to set up their own plant and fund it and manage it themselves, it's better for that to be done by the private sector. So I think government, provide rules and regulations, and I think they're very good. So like in agriculture, the whole area around standards and SPS is a really important area for them to set the rules. And then the compliance is on the side of the private sector. And so understanding those roles, I think, is quite...
It is very, very important. I liked the idea of scaling up, because at the end what we need is to create impact, and you can't create that impact at a small scale level. I think that is what we are even having as one of the challenge when we talk of small scale farming. Then it becomes very difficult to reach that level where we can create the impact that we want. Let's take a break. And when we come, we will look at those things, those factors which could attract more the private sector in agriculture. Welcome to Kikao. What would attract the private sector to invest more in agriculture in Africa now and in the future?
Well, some very fundamentals of business is one, predictability, consistency, that you can make plans, that you really need an environment that creates that ability to do the long-term planning that says it's going to be predictable and understandable. Certainly it's not going to be that you can understand everything, but you understand that the enabling environment has a certain level of stability that you can put a 5-year plan together and start to execute it. Particularly in agriculture, I think we run into this situation is, generally there's one planting season a year. Some places there's 2 planting seasons a year. But in agriculture, that means that you spend a whole bunch of money up front creating your products, getting it to the marketplace, and then you have one short window of time for them to actually use and plant your product or to use it in the field. And then your next cycle is coming the next year. If you want to really get that strong investment over time, you need to see that first your customers, your farmers, are going to be profitable. They need to be able to have a situation where they're making money, because in our business, we don't make money unless the farmers make money. And so our job is to make those farmers successful.
What do you think would be, let's say, some of the recommendation, something to change so that we can create a better environment for the private sector to feel more comfortable and invest more in the agricultural sector? And here, I'm not talking only of the productivity or production part of it, but the whole value chain.
Sure. Just to go back to, before I answer that, is, an interesting fact is agro-processing in Africa is capacity utilization is between 40 and 60%. That's underutilized, right, in all the countries in East Africa. So what that's telling you, and you're importing more food than you're exporting, so you're still, on the supply side, got a big challenge to meet that demand, right? So in order to start closing that gap between supply and demand, I think there's a need to try and tackle the various constraints in the value chain. So that obviously starts on the farm itself, with the productivity of the farmer, but then there are fragmentation of supply chains. So you have a lot of post-harvest losses, estimated to be about 25%. Then you've got problems with storage, which is linked to post-harvest losses, but you have the problem of, say, aflatoxin because of lack of compliance with the quality. And then you get the challenge of linking to the market. And you've got many middlemen in that value chain. So digital solutions is one way to link farmers closer to the market. So these are some of the areas that can be done to structure trade, I think, a little bit more in the value chain, to shorten the time it takes to get from farm to market.
Yeah, that is very, very good. We have talked about the challenges, we have talked about what is needed to be fixed, I think, and then the enabling environment around there, which can slow down or accelerate the adoption of technologies which would come to help solve those issues. Let's take a break, and when we come, let's discuss how to align the needs of the two parties, public and private. Welcome to Kikao. Since I think almost 30 years, Africa's leaders have expressed the need to transform the agriculture sector and make it more impactful in the lives of the farmers, more impactful economically, etc. Transform agriculture. This is one. That is the desired and goal of all the countries. But yes, we have many challenges and we have gone through them. Now, the question is, how could we align the needs of the private sector and the goals of the public sector so that we can reach that desired impact that we all would like to reach?
So, I mean, it's a good question because actually both parties are quite different, right? And I think in any partnership, I think you need communication is very important, right? So I do think it's very important for each party to understand the other side of that partnership. So, and understanding the respective roles. So I think the private sector has certain needs, and we were talking about access to finance. So for instance, the banking sector to commercially lend to the agriculture sector, they see it as being very risky. And I think the public sector, they want that finance to be made available, but they need to appreciate the side from the private sector as well. And then understanding that, then I think solutions can be found to address those constraints that can help, for instance, mitigate the risk for the banking sector to engage with the agriculture sector. So today, I mean, I'm just giving you an example. Now we talk about blended finance as a way to de-risk private capital to support the agriculture sector, which is a way to address that need that the private sector has. But I do think, I mean, what we do a lot of at Trademark is we do form platforms around different areas of work to bring the private sector together with the public sector. I think those kind of platforms where you can align and understand each other's side of the coin is quite important.
Communication and agreement on the role that we need to play. Yes,
yeah, communications and those things are extremely important. But there's a reason I asked for the public sector colleague to go first. The reality for us in the private sector is that we have to have an environment where you can see that there's going to be profitability. To get that process started, the reality is that we need catalysts to help start the engine, so to speak. The role of the public sector is actually to manage that risk that the farmer has and create the environment for that farmer to take the risk. Think about it, if you're a farmer in Africa and you want to produce 6 tons per hectare on your maize, you can't do that without making some investments of the inputs. It's going to be substantially more than what you're investing today. But if there's no safety net, there's no risk, and you have a drought, as that farmer, you are looking at a major loss of your investment. Consequently, it doesn't get started because the risk for that individual farmer, although if you took it across 1,000 farmers, you know 90% of them are going to be fine. But if you're in the 10% that has a failure, it's a risk that you as an individual can't take. This is the role that the public sector has of creating that environment of saying, we will be with you to manage the risk so that you will make those investments and know that we have your back in case there's a failure. And this is to be able to help create that environment where risk is something the farmer is willing to take. That can get the cycle started, that can lead to increased productivity, that can lead to increased profits of those farmers, that leads to them buying other things and investing and creating new markets and developing and growth. So it's really about that role of the government and the public sector understanding how, when they collectively work together to manage that risk for farming, that they can create that virtuous cycle going.
Yeah, that's great. I think here it is very clear. To have an effective and efficient public-private sector partnership working, we need to create an environment which enables the different parties to predict so that they can plan a certain level of consistency, an enabling environment which is favorable for all that partnership to work properly, profitability for the farmer so that actually there is enough money to invest in the sustainability of the whole business. De-risking agriculture is very important for the private sector to feel comfortable in this environment. And de-risking will require that the public sector comes in more. So we understand here that the public sector, the private sector, partnership is very indispensable to make sure that our agriculture in Africa comes to the level of satisfying our expectations in terms of it playing an economic development role. We call everyone to think and to play its part of the role so that our agriculture can benefit from the input from the private sector, but also the public sector playing its own role. Ladies and gentlemen, viewers, I thank you very much for your participation, and I invite you for the next Kikao.
And now to our terminology of the week on Science Speak. This week we look at the terminology apiculture. The term apiculture refers to the care and management of honeybees for the production of honey, of course, and wax, usually known simply as beekeeping. The term comes from the Latin word apis, which means bee. An engaging session there, and the verdict is clear that partnerships are the way to go, and the continent too must play its part. Until next time, thank you for watching Kikao. My name is Joe Ageyo.